Hi everyone, daily chess puzzle deep analysis number 3. I've selected a puzzle which has a difficulty around 2500 for today. Have a look at it. You can scan the QR code with your other device and jump straight into the puzzle. So I suggest, as always, attempt the puzzle yourself and maybe spend 5 to 10 minutes thinking about the position. How would you solve it? That way you will maximize your learning experience. Also, you can use the approach that I've suggested, the 6 steps, go through them on your own if you wish to, and see how far you can go and whether that helps you to identify the solution to this puzzle. Step number 1, understanding the position. 4 elements: counting material, evaluating king safety, looking at open diagonals, files and ranks, and also evaluating each piece. So try and do that on your own. First of all, counting the material. Let's count for white. 6 pawns, black have 6 pawns as well. 2 rooks, a knight, and each side has a bishop and a queen. So absolutely equal position from material viewpoint. Second thing to look at is king safety. King safety for white. The king is uncastled, so more or less in danger. If it was a real game, we might think about castling, of course. The other thing is that there are no immediate threats to the white king. So if we need to, according to this position, we might actually consider other moves rather than castling. So how about black's king safety? They're more or less okay. However, there is close, dangerous proximity of the queen on h6, quite well positioned, creating threats on h7. If we didn't have this pawn, for example, so assisted by the rook, we would mate on h7. So already this prompts us to put rook on one of these fields, probably not h3 because of the bishop. Thinking about how is it possible to put the rook on h4 or to get rid of the pawn on h2? That will create a dangerous attacking motive with the queen. So I've sort of skipped to tactical motives, but we were talking about king safety. So the black king is more or less safe. The pawns are intact. However, there is no dark square bishop. It has been probably exchanged on d4, I suppose. Yeah, as you can see, one of the moves was bishop takes d4 3 moves ago. That creates a weakness on the dark squares near the king. There is also a well-positioned knight, which can jump and create some threats on e7 or f6 in certain variations, predominantly on e7. So with e7, if there was no queen, it will be check. King has to go to h8, and then we mate on f8. Okay, this rook doesn't do much at the moment, but that's a separate discussion. So king safety, for white, it's okay. For black, it's quite dangerous. So potentially we might think about checkmating motives. Open diagonals, files and ranks. Queen is positioned on a semi-open file. This rook on d4 is positioned on an open file as well. This bishop is positioned on a good diagonal. Queen also takes place on quite a good place. It's not fantastic. It's far away from the main center of events, from the center and from the queen on h6, but it still has this diagonal. Fourth element in understanding the position is evaluating each piece. Rook on a8 is terrible. Knight on b8 also undeveloped, should go on to be c6 or d7. Bishop on e6 is fine, but it's preventing a move like e6 or e5. This rook is not in the game. However, it looks at protecting f7. Queen is a little bit far away, but as I said, it's on a quite a good diagonal if situation was different with white's pieces. What about white pieces? This bishop doesn't do much. This pawn is protected, so playing on d3 doesn't make any sense. Putting it on a f3 either doesn't make any sense. We cannot play on g4. Playing on h5 will be simply taken. This rook is hanging. It's attacked by a queen. This rook is not in the game, so we either need to castle or create some opportunities for it to enter the game. So sometimes in some certain positions we play h4 and h5, forcing take on g6 or g6 takes h5. We take according to the situation with the bishop or with the rook. So in these circumstances, we would take with the rook and create quite dangerous situations and attack on h7. Queen is well positioned. It actually suggests a motive of a checkmate, and we have seen some variants which can happen, and we need to think of them a little bit later. So if we were to perform a checkmate, then probably these two pieces were to be included. This rook might be included, but as I mentioned earlier, the great place to be is on h4. Counting material, king safety, open diagonals, files, and ranks, evaluating each pieces, everything has been done. So let's go to step number 2, thinking about possible motives. 3 things to consider: checkmate, winning material, crucial outcome. Again, pause the video and consider which of these scenarios you think are most likely to occur. So from step 1, we've considered every piece. We thought that this knight can potentially take on e7, creating a direct threat of a mate, taking on e7, king to h8, queen takes f8, mate. The only thing that prevents us from doing so is the queen on a7, because if we take on e7, the queen will capture on e7, and that's it. So in a lot of these puzzles, we actually can think about distracting this queen from its place, and that will be fantastic because we would be able to execute our mate in 2. So that's one motive, checkmating. Second motive, I've mentioned that the great positioning of queen on h6 creates a threat of mate, again, on h7, but we need something to help us execute that plan. That something is typically a knight on g5. Our knight is far away, so knight on g5 attacking the h7, inevitable mate, or a rook on h4. There is no quick way in a puzzle to bring this rook onto h4. The only way to bring a rook on h4 is this rook. The problem is there is a pawn on e4. So if the pawn was on e3 or on e5, then we would have played rook to h4, creating a very serious threat of mate on h7. So already we have 2 ideas. One is associated with knight takes e7 and check and queen to f8. And another idea, second idea, is moving the rook to h4, but for that we need to move the pawn to e5. I don't see any ideas associated with the bishop. I also don't see any ideas associated with the rook on h1. So in my opinion, this puzzle is about these pieces and pawns, and the tactical motive is checkmating. So we've determined the possible tactical motive is checkmating, and we see 2 mechanisms to achieve that goal. Let's go to step number 3, identifying immediate threats. 2 questions that we need to answer. Is there anything hanging? And also, are there threats of mate in 1 or 2 moves from both sides? Pause the video, have a go, and I'll explain in more detail. So do black have anything hanging? Not really at the moment. So there is a potential threat of e7, but queen at the moment is protecting that. Is there a problem for white pieces? Yes, there is. Yes, there are. There is a rook on d4, which will be taken by the queen. It's unprotected. Also, because black's pieces are undeveloped, there is a threat of exchanges on d5, e takes d. In this puzzle, black is 100% defending the position. So one way to defend a bad position is actually to exchange your pieces with better pieces of the opponent. So definitely bishop takes d5 is an option, because it actually helps with the threat of knight takes e7. But the main threat is queen takes d4, which at the moment is not possible. The capture is not possible, because if queen takes d4, we will take on e7, with a mentioned mate on f8. However, there is also an option to play bishop takes d5. Then we will have to take rook takes d5, and it will be probably more or less equal position, probably still better for white. But we definitely miss out on some forceful tactics. Okay, I don't see any other exceptional threats. So let's continue with our analysis. Step 4, establishing candidate moves. Let's have a look at the position and find 3 or 4 candidate moves. We need to identify checks, captures, and threats. Please pause the video and identify all possible checks, captures, and threats. Possible checks: queen to g7, queen f8, queen h7, queen g6, knight to e7, knight f6. That's all. Possible captures: queen takes h7, queen takes f8, queen takes g6, knight takes e7, bishop takes b5. That's all. Threats. So we thought about something about putting the rook on h4, because this is an extremely powerful file. So to do that, we need to push the pawn on e5. So that's going to be a candidate move associated with the threat. So we won't analyze all of the possible checks. I won't include them into candidate moves because some of them are do not have any sense. So for example, queen takes h7 straight away will be recaptured by the king, and we don't have a forcing mate or anything like that. Queen takes g6 will be recaptured by a pawn. We lose. Queen takes f8, king takes f8. We don't have a mate or a fork or anything like that. Knight takes e7, queen takes e7. I don't see how are we going to continue our attack. So disregard that straight away. Bishop takes b5 is a bit ridiculous because we've determined that this puzzle is about these pieces and pawns here. It's not about A and B. And of course, b5 is protected by a6. So disregard that move. So out of the checks, we don't knight to f6. That's going to be ef. So there are no queen to g7, of course, king takes g7, that's it. So we don't have a sensible check. So we are going to disregard from candidate moves all checks and move on to captures. Captures, we have seen the captures here and here already because they're a check. So therefore, we're not taking into account these captures. Knight to e7 as well. Bishop to b5. I also talked about it in checks for some reason. But anyway, doesn't make any sense. Interesting enough, the only possible reasonable move out of everything is pawn to e5, associated with the idea rook to h4. So we already identified a possible solution because all other moves, they do not achieve any advantage. So moving any of these pawns is extremely slow. Castling does not create additional advantages or threats for white. Moving the bishop anywhere does not help at all. So effectively, using the motive that we have associated with the rook being on h4 is probably going to be a solution. So we have to move the pawn to e5. That's going to be our candidate move. So with checks, disregard all checks. They don't have any sense. We've reviewed all of them. Captures, also disregard all captures. We've reviewed all of them. Threats, we've identified one threat is e5. with the idea of moving rook to h4. That's the only sensible thing that we need to calculate. So I don't mention here a fourth category, which is a quiet move, but I don't see any other move that has any sense. So other moves, especially in tactical puzzles, it's very rare to see a quiet move, especially when the motive is checkmating. So unlikely that there is any other move. If we correctly identified the tactical motive being checkmate, I don't think that it's possible of there being some kind of quiet move. So what we need to do, it's almost likely that the solution is going to be e5. The only problem is that most likely this puzzle will require a thorough calculation. But in the puzzle, you can actually make the e5 move because there is nothing else to play. Of course, in a practical game, if we would think about a move like e5, we would probably think, 30 minutes, because the issue with e5 is that we have a rook hanging. So playing e5, queen takes d4, that's going to be our first calculation. The problem is that we give a check on e7, king, only move, king h8, mate on f8. So queen takes d4 is not possible. Black will be checkmated in 2 moves. So what other defenses do black have? e5, the threat is rook h4. They can also try and take the knight. So we play e5, bishop takes d5. We will play rook to h4. Rook to h4, how do you protect h7? Is there a way to protect it? These pieces are completely helpless. Will rook help with defending h7? I don't think so. Queen can take on f2, but we will capture it with the king, no problem. Another option for black is going to be anticipate after e5, anticipate that our plan is to move the rook to h4 and play something to defend h7 straight away. So a way to defend it is going to be by using this rook and putting it on f7, but they also need to move the f-pawn somewhere. So presumably to f6. So f6 is going to be the third move that the black can consider. e5, f6, what do we play as white? If we play rook to h4, black will successfully defend with f7. Rook to f7, protecting h7. And is there a continuation? I don't see anything. We can probably take on with the pawn on f6. So black will not recapture it with the rook because of the threat of the mate. They will capture it with the pawn. And if we capture it with the knight, checking the king, then they can take it with the rook then, because now a queen will help to protect h7. So playing e5, f6, we can't play rook h4. There isn't any continuation. e5, f6, we need to find a different solution. So the solution is out of the dynamics and the motives that we've discussed is e takes f6, creating a threat, immediate threat of a mate on g7. So black have to either recapture or take it with the rook. So e5, f6, ef, rook takes f6, knight takes with a check, and black are down in material, and also there will be a quick mate on d8 or winning even more material. e5, f6, ef, ef. What's the continuation here? It's going to be knight takes f6, rook has to take on f6, otherwise they will be in trouble. Rook takes f6, rook d8 check. If the rook protects the f8, we will take it with a mate on f8. Once again, e5, f6, ef, ef, knight takes f6, rook takes f6, rook d8 check. There is a possible other move, king to f7, but then we mate on f8 because these fields are taken by black's own pieces. e5, f6, ef. What if black plays rook f7, ignoring the pawn on f6 and protecting h7? e5, f6, ef, rook f7. Now our pawn is on f6. We can take on e7 with a check. If the king goes to h8, we will mate on d8. Or mate in another move. e5, f6, rook f7, ef, knight takes e7, check. If black takes on e7, we will not recapture it with the pawn. We will simply mate through rook d8, because if the rook covers, then we will capture it, and again mate on f8 in any scenario. That seems very sensible. So let's play e5, f6. We decided to play ef, rook f7. Now we can reconsider the position, of course. But that's going to be the forcing. Oh, computer decided to take it with e7 because all of the variants that we looked at, they lead to mate, and this is simply losing because they will lose too much material. F takes e, and that's the solution of the puzzle. So let's have a look at other possible scenarios with the use of the computer. e5. What if black played? Of course, we've seen that. Mate. What if they play queen to c5? What's the point of that? Probably to give a check on c1. Rook to h4, queen to c1. Oh, we just take it. It's easy to miss that retreat in a blitz or bullet game. Okay, also suggestions. A bishop takes c5, rook h4. Yeah, nothing else to do. Give up the material. f5, still the same as f6. Take. If they take, we take. If they take, this is a mate. Actually, we could have made it like this. I haven't seen that. Rook to f6 loses material. Again, mate the same way. King f7. queen to d4, queen f8, mate. Okay, so hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, please like and subscribe to my channel. Thanks a lot. See you soon.